Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about, does loneliness worsen ADHD? So I'll be talking for about 20-25 minutes. This video may well be longer because there will be questions at the end. They may be related to this topic or they may be on other topics. And if someone who's listening in can just put in a note that they can hear me, because I'm using a microphone for the first time rather than the earbuds, and I think everything's working, but I don't want to record this all and learn that nobody could hear anything. So okay, great, you can hear me. So as usual, I'll start with the take-home message and then move on to the bulk of the talk. So the take-home message is that ADHD, there are 20 years of studies, more than 20, showing that there's a strong association with ADHD contributing to loneliness or associated with children and adults with ADHD feeling lonelier. And in recent years, there's been more study on trying to look at whether loneliness contributes to negative outcomes in physical and mental health. And those studies, none of them are specifically looking at, or very few, whether loneliness is contributing to ADHD, but these studies have shown that loneliness is associated with later decreases in cognitive functions, including attention, planning, organization, emotional regulation, and working memory. All of those are ADHD symptoms. So what I'm trying to present today is that while loneliness doesn't create ADHD, it can worsen the severity of ADHD, which means that it will convert some individuals who are subsyndromal or have milder versions of ADHD into full-blown ADHD. And this means that we have a feedback loop, that ADHD creates loneliness and loneliness contributes to more ADHD-like behavior, which then again can contribute to loneliness. And I'll hopefully at the end have some time to talk about what we can do about this. So launching into the talk itself. So the first thing is to make an important distinction between social isolation, which you can measure objectively, just how many connections a person has, how much time they're spending with those connections. So social isolation is being alone. Some people are actually pretty happy being alone. So loneliness is different in that loneliness is a subjective feeling that you have less social connection than you want. And the two certainly are correlated, but there are people who seem to be socially active, connected, who feel lonely. And there are people, so you can have social isolation without feeling lonely. You can have loneliness with apparent social connectedness. So, I mean, again, usually there is some correlation, but they are distinct and separate variables. And in some situations, they predict one social isolation is connected with one outcome and loneliness with a different one. But they both clearly have impact even when you control for the other one. So one of the problems with the studies in this area is that when we're talking about loneliness, we have fairly sophisticated, although imperfect, ways of measuring ADHD rating scales. There's ways, again, to quantitatively measure social isolation on a variety of variables or dimensions in terms of strength of connections, frequency of connections, number of connections. Loneliness is usually assessed by one or most two or three questions. Do you feel lonely? And almost every study that I've seen makes it a categorical answer. So you are, yes, you're lonely, or no, you're not lonely. Clearly, loneliness exists on a spectrum. So by arbitrarily having it as a discrete yes, no binary variable, we're already degrading the information we could be getting from studying it. And I mean, it means that some people will be miscategorized. Some people who are really substantially lonely will be put in the non-lonely column and the other way around. So that's one potential problem with much of the studies. The other big issue is that many of these studies are just looking at a certain point of time, associating a trait such as ADHD with loneliness, and if they're associated at the same time, that just tells you they run together. It doesn't tell you anything about causality. Some of the more informative studies are longitudinal. So that means they look at either ADHD or loneliness at a certain point of time, and then they look at a subsequent time to see if loneliness at point A is associated with point B with problems with concentration, problems with attention, problems with emotional regulation. Again, that does not prove causality, but that gives you a better handle. There can be reverse causality, there can be other issues, but usually the longitudinal studies give us a little more information as what's contributing to what. So why are we spending so much time these days talking about loneliness? Other than that, in numerous studies, and Vivek Murphy, the current Surgeon General, released a report a little more than a year ago, I believe, calling attention to loneliness as a major public health issue, that the impacts of loneliness on heart attacks, strokes, death from all sorts of conditions, mental health issues. Loneliness has a bigger impact than smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, being moderately overweight, moderate hypertension. It's comparable to that. So this is important at a public health level. So why, though, why would loneliness be so important? And some of this is speculative, some of it's based on sociology and biology, but when we're talking evolutionary stories, we can't go back and prove what was going on and what natural selection was selecting among hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years ago. But humans are clearly social animals. Being part of the pack, being protected by the herd, your family, your group, your tribe, was vitally important. Lone humans, even though we have stories throughout of the lone hermit, but people who are alone are not very likely to make it too long. So being connected to your group is vitally important. And loneliness is the pain of being disconnected from your group or other people. And although for decades we thought that the poets talking about the pain of loneliness was sort of a metaphor, what we've learned through neuroscience studies in the last several decades is that many of the same, it's not completely one-to-one perfect overlap, but many of the same pain centers that light up in response to physical pain, you burn your hand, you stub your toe, you rupture a disc in your back, areas of the brain associated with pain activate, light up. With loneliness and other forms of emotional pain, there is many of those same similar pain centers also are activated. So it's not just a metaphor. There are many brain processing similarities between the pain of loneliness and pain of physical pain. Excuse me. So what is pain there for? Pain seems to be there to say, this is important and do something about it. So if your hand is on the hot stove or sticking in the fire and it's hurting, get your hand out of there, remove it. If your ruptured disc is causing pain, don't do those movements again. Take some rest, take care of it. If you're lonely, do something to resolve that. Find ways to reconnect, reassociate, rebuild friendships, make yourself less lonely. So there's a fair amount of research over the last few decades that loneliness, people, untreated loneliness, uncorrected loneliness leads to greater hypervigilance about social interaction. So you're more worried about being injured or rejected again. So social anxiety is connected with it. You are more sensitive to slights, and your whole sympathetic nervous system is keyed up. Your cortisol is flowing level greater. And we know that there are long-term negative health consequences of having an overactivated sympathetic nervous system and overactivated cortisol hypothalamic axis activation. So the connection between ADHD and loneliness has been most studied in children, as with many other aspects of ADHD, and it's not absolutely every study. There's a few outliers, but it's more than a substantial minority. It's fairly overwhelming majority of studies that have looked at loneliness in children with ADHD found children with ADHD rate themselves as feeling more lonely than their non-ADHD peers. And some of the more sophisticated studies show that, and again, if you just make ADHD a binary yes-no situation, that degrades your ability to look for associations. But if you look at studies where ADHD is, you're measuring the extent or the severity of ADHD, the more severe your ADHD, the greater your likelihood connection, rather than these are just associated through some compounding variable. And many people have posited, well, that's just because who are lonely or depressed, and depression is associated with ADHD. But the relationship between loneliness and ADHD exists even when you subtract or control for depression. So some other, depression, anxiety, other comorbid mental health issues do seem to account for some of the association, but it's a small part of the association. And people who have tried to studied and theorized about this suggest that there's several reasons children with ADHD are more likely to be lonely. So on objective measures, when they're trying that people with ADHD, children and adults, are more likely to have difficulties in relationships. They're more likely to have poorer quality of relationships. They're more likely in adulthood to be single. They're more likely to be divorced. This is a little bit in contrast to one of my other talks where we talked about sex and ADHD, where actually those with ADHD in most studies are actually likely to be sexually active at earlier ages, more partners, more risky behaviors. But with the relationship end, there's a lag or below the mean. So ways in which having ADHD can lead to loneliness or social isolation is that one is getting back to the neurodiversity topic we touched on a few weeks ago. People with ADHD are often perceived as being different. In much of our society, differentness is scorned, pushed away, stigmatized. And so people with ADHD are being perceived as being different, and they're being criticized for being different. And that being criticized not only has no effect internally on how the person feels about themselves and their confidence in making social connections. If they've been told they did something wrong or stupid or off in one situation, they may worry, am I going to do it again? Particularly given with ADHD, they may not even have been paying attention and know what they did that was so wrong or bad. There's also studies showing that people with ADHD have a tendency to miss social cues, and interestingly, some of the studies differentiate ASD, autism spectrum disorders, from ADHD, and that this is an overgeneralization and oversimplification. You certainly can have both going on at the same time, but with ASD, it's more that the person really doesn't understand, comprehend the social cues. With ADHD is if you ask them, what does this face look like? What's this behavior mean? They understand, they know, they just weren't paying attention and attending to it. So that can lead to social problems and disruption and eventually loneliness. Other aspects of ADHD is a tendency to invade others' personal space. So literally stepping on people's toes, cutting in line, blurting things out. So it's physically as well as verbally blurting things out, and often things that other people would be more discreet and not mention. Many people with ADHD sort of value that I'm the truth teller, and what they're saying may well be true, but in polite society, most other people wouldn't have said that. So the person who is the recipient of that feels hurt or insulted and doesn't want to be your friend. Other ways ADHD can contribute to social isolation is hyperfocus. So when you're so absorbed in a task, everyone else leaves to go to lunch as a group, and you weren't intentionally brushing them off or thinking you're too good to go out with them. You were just so absorbed in your work, you weren't even aware of what was going on. And hyperactivity of ADHD can also cause social problems. So if you're fidgeting all the time, you're making noise. I've had people with ADHD, I've seen it in classrooms and others, where the person with ADHD might be hypersensitive or complaining about other people making noise, and they're completely unaware of when they themselves are making distracting sounds or movements for other people. So there's been some recent work on, so we mentioned also in one of the previous talks that people with ADHD are overrepresented among those who have gaming addictions or problematic internet use. Both of those are also independently associated with higher rates of loneliness, and particularly gaming addiction, at least in one study, seemed to be more problematic than just problematic internet use. And there's also been a number of studies in the last very few years about how loneliness during the COVID epidemic was particularly harsh or likely to affect or increase loneliness among those with ADHD, particularly children that have been studied. So that's all looking at how ADHD may contribute to loneliness. Now looking at loneliness and how it contributes to mental health issues. Now, far and away, the two biggest angles that have been examined are how loneliness contributes to depression, and that's been looked at in children, young adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults with ADHD, with loneliness contributing to depression. And there's also been a lot of attention looking at how loneliness may contribute or be a risk factor for dementia in the elderly. And those are thoroughly replicable findings. What I'm sort of extracting from much of that work is that much of what they're looking at when they look at specific symptoms is, again, that loneliness is associated with poor emotional regulation. That's a symptom of ADHD. It's associated with poor impulse control. That's a symptom of ADHD. It's associated with poor short-term memory. That's associated with ADHD. It's associated with poor planning and organization. And in at least one study that tried to do a factor analysis and pull them apart, the strongest association of among these different executive function categories was between loneliness and planning and working memory. So again, these are associations, and even in the longitudinal studies, these are looking at loneliness at one point in time, predicting problems at another point in time, but they can't rule out reverse causality. So for example, maybe, again, I talked about dementia just a few weeks ago. Dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, at least we know, is happening for 20, 25, 30 years in many people before observable memory apathy symptoms are detectable or recorded. But maybe these people are actually suffering aspects of their dementia earlier, and part of that could well be social isolation, loneliness. So it's hard to conclusively say that loneliness is causing these things, but there's a strong association, and the temporal association at least suggests that loneliness precedes these problems. And there's neuroanatomic evidence that there's stronger connectivity in default mode network of the brain for people who are lonely. Again, depression itself is associated with a overly strongly wired default mode network. The default mode network is what you're doing when you're ruminating, thinking about yourself, thinking about your life, worrying about sort of me-centered problems rather than interacting with the world, or performing a task. So there's, again, neuroanatomic evidence that loneliness is associated with greater wiring, strengthening within the default mode network, and poorer wiring to attentive networks. Whether this is just because someone who's lonely is interacting less with the world, they're getting less stimulation, and that's changing their wiring, or whether it's because loneliness is a toxic, stressful condition and you may have greater cortisol, or whether it's because loneliness leads itself to rumination and you may be strengthening the default mode network just by practicing that, it's hard to know. So what can we do about this? So often when I say, again, I think pretty clearly we have evidence of a feedback loop, that the more ADHD symptoms you have, the more likely you are to be lonely. The more lonely you are, the more likely you are to worsen ADHD symptoms. So some people hear feedback loop and think, oh my God, that means I can't ever get out of it. It's always reinforcing itself. I tend to frame it the other way. If you have a feedback loop, anywhere you break it, it's broken. So you can choose to work on any piece of it. So for example, if it's, I'll jump to the medication front first. Stimulant medications, to the extent that they reduce ADHD symptomatology, should, according to some of the studies, again, this has not been directly tested, but you would expect if more ADHD, more severe ADHD is more strongly connected to loneliness, if you're treating your ADHD, that should lower your risk for being lonely. Again, whether they're SSRIs or buspirone are specifically effective for reducing loneliness, they're effective for a social anxiety component that can be secondary to loneliness and can be part of what perpetuates loneliness. So medication may be a helpful way for breaking part of that loop, but more of the work is probably going to be involved in cognitive behavioral therapy, reframing fears about, how likely is it that you're really being rejected? What does that mean? What's the severity of that? Does that mean just because someone said something critical or said something at one point, they really want to have nothing to do with you? It's also social skills training can be helpful in helping people learn how to connect better. People with ADHD, particularly training them to attend to social cues. Again, they usually can figure out what they mean if they see them, but they're not usually looking for them. And some of the things I usually encourage people with ADHD and who've had trouble in social situations is, to the extent that they're comfortable, being both proactive and reparative. By that I mean, if you're in a workplace situation and yes, there may be reasons not to bring up ADHD, but if people have already commented, noticed that you are late for meetings, if you blurt things out, if you're not as well organized before the meetings, it can be helpful to talk ahead of time about your ADHD and whether they're bosses, co-workers at the same level, or underlings. It can also be helpful to say, I have ADHD. If you hear me going off track at a meeting, say this to help rein me in. Or if you hear me going on too long, or I may need a reminder to get to the meeting on time, or I may need... So warning people ahead of time often makes it more understandable to them and more tolerant to them, so they're less likely to reject you. And the reparative component is apologizing afterwards. People are often afraid of apologizing. If you did something later and you think it was wrong or inappropriate, it usually makes sense to say, sorry, I did this. I wasn't intending to cut you off when you were in the middle of your presentation. So that's about all I'm going to say with loneliness and ADHD. I believe it's a feedback loop, but it's one that can be addressed. And it's important to address because, again, of the other health implications of being lonely too long. And if you are happy being solitary and relatively isolated, great. If that works for you, don't worry. Next week's topic is going to be hoarding and ADHD, and I believe there are some questions, so I will try to get to them now. So, hello, Dennis. Environmental exposure shapes the developed brain and affect mental health, rated risk, and resilience factors. I'm only... I don't know if you're referring to something else, but that's all I'm reading is that he suggests. So it sounds like there's a previous half to the message, but I'm not seeing it, and I'm not seeing any of that. So again, Dennis. So Dennis asks, are you aware of the research of Dr. Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg regarding the impact of environmental factors on mental health? Yeah, I mean, there's a wealth of researchers who've, you know, biology is important, our genetic potential is important, but even just looking at the genes, which genes get expressed is more important than which genes you have, or at least as important. And we know very clearly that gene expression is affected by early environmental in utero and early childhood family dynamics. With ADHD, there's a lot of work that families with lots of conflict, families with over authoritarian discipline, even for the extent of the genetic component of ADHD, kids are likely to have more severe ADHD and, again, more likely to have depression, anxiety, a host of other problems. So for anyone who thinks it's nature or nurture, it's been so clearly settled for decades that both are important in pretty much every situation. So I don't know if I answered the question. So Mr. AKA 1996 says, are you familiar with the controversy of guanfacine being a potential cardiac valvulopathic risk due to serotonin 2B agonism? The simple answer is I don't know what the data there shows or doesn't show. I mean, given that the FDA has pulled other, like the fen-phen diet drug for serotonin-related valvulopathies, I would think that if the data were robust, guanfacine would already be off the market. So that's all I'll say. So I don't know the details of what data has been brought to light or whether it's mostly speculation. So I will try to look that one up though. And I do know some good cardiology friends who even think the and so that was fenfluramine and phentermine combination for weight loss. They felt that the data there actually didn't present a very strong case for an association for serotonergic valvulopathy, but that's just one, two cardiology friends. So I'm not seeing any other questions. That's fine. Maybe there'll be more next week, which will be hoarding and ADHD. So I'll be on the same 6 p.m. West Coast time, 9 p.m. East Coast time. But if you're in Hawaii like me, it'll be an hour different because we don't go on daylight savings and all the rest you do. So I'm trying to keep it constant for the rest of the world, even though I know Europe and America change at different times. Anyway, stay healthy, stay happy, and have a good week. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks for the rest of you for being here, and let others know about these videos if you found them useful.